The Postal Service wants to scare you. No, not in the normal way by coming to your house every day or when you walk into one of their offices. Hi, I'm Scott Ott with Bill Whittle and Stephen Green, and this episode of Right Angle is brought to you by the members at BillWhittle.com. Gentlemen, earlier this year, the Trump administration ordered a study of the U.S. Postal Service to determine what could be done about the money-losing operation. And right now, the two major labor unions that represent postal workers have tried to get out in front of the ultimate conclusions of that report and any action the Trump administration might want to take, particularly the privatization of the Postal Service. They have created a commercial that you can see on YouTube, and they are running, I would assume, on television, if anybody still watches that. But then again, does anybody still send a letter? They are basically portraying corporate ownership of the Postal Service as a net loss for people who mail things. So in the commercial, you see people, trying to get their mail out of their mailbox, but it doesn't come out because, of course, in the area where you live, you're probably not going to get daily mail delivery when it goes private. And then in other cases, there are people trying to put mail in, and the mailbox will reject the mail and actually shoot it out and hit the people in the back of the head. And the commercial actually ends with this guy out on some sort of country road taking a sledgehammer to his corporate mailbox. And they want the American public to believe that things are not going to go well if we switch to private mail service. And Stephen Green, I have to admit, the power to create post offices and post roads is actually enshrined in the Constitution. And there are some debate about what that in fact means, but courts have held over the years, they've given broad latitude to Congress to be able to not just supervise the creation of those things, but to actually fund and run those operations. Isn't it a little bit disingenuous for somebody like you, who's a constitutional conservative, to let your libertarianism overtake your good constitutional judgment and say it might be okay for private organizations to run the Postal Service?
Well, so many things. And I always love the devil's advocate way you have phrasing these questions. I look at it from...
oh, you have no idea.
I look at it from... oh, I'm sorry. Go ahead, Scott.
I was going to say, in college, we called it journalism. But if you want to say devil's advocate, go ahead.
Okay, I look at it not just from a constitutional perspective. I look at the highway system and go, that's an extension of the post-road power granted to Congress in the Constitution. I have no problem with that, and I love driving on the highways, especially when you get on the open road and you can really floor it. That makes me so happy. And that's because of this power granted to Congress. What it doesn't say is that the government has to deliver the mail. And you know what? I spent the 90s really honing my drinking skills, but I didn't spend so much time drinking that I don't remember that I didn't forget that going postal is a term having to do with going crazy and shooting a place up. That was coined because of the post office. So it's become a really shoddy organization. I'll tell you what shocks me, though, and this is one of the reasons the post office is so bad. I came across in one of my old atlases. I collect old atlases. It's one of my hobbies. A postal rate chart for calculating what the postage was going to be to send your stamp different distances and what the different city distances were and all the rest. You didn't just pay a 5-cent stamp or whatever to go from New York to L.A. That would be a much more expensive stamp, and it was a cheaper one to send something, just to the next town over. So we didn't always have one rate across the country. So what we have here is this kind of socialist idea of one price for whatever the service is, and the post office can't make money that way. It just can't. And so we end up in this trap now where they charge higher and higher prices for those universal stamps that people use less and less of because they're getting so much more expensive, but they make up the rest with the bulk mail that you don't want, the advertisers, the flyers, the things that literally goes directly from your mailbox into the trash can 6 days a week. It's absurd. There's no point to it except for two things. One, to subsidize the fact that nobody uses the mail anymore. And two, to generate, this part is a little conspiracy theory, but I believe it anyway. And the second part is to generate enough work to justify all of those unionized workers that the post office has. So we're in this trap of a post office that can't cut expenses, but has to keep charging higher and higher prices for a service that people use less and less of. So you know what, maybe if it's an absolute national necessity that people in rural areas have to have their mail delivery, fine. Make it 1 day a week. That's plenty for paying your bills and all the rest. And as for the rest, turn it over to UPS, turn it over to FedEx, and let the Federal Post Office, which would just be a small office in Washington, D.C., supervise that so that we know that it's working the way it should.
See, Bill, what Steve Green just said is exactly what the Postal Employees Union is trying to scare us into believing, that if you live in rural areas, you are not going to get daily mail service. And an argument could be made that people in rural areas actually have a greater need for such things. And for Steve to propose that there be some sort of Tennessee Valley Authority that's focused on mail rather than rural electrification is actually playing right into their hands. Bill, the Postal Service used to provide a much more essential role in our lives than it does now, since I don't know about you, but I think there is one bill that we now pay by check that we put in the mail, and everything else is handled electronically. The Postal Service has been losing money, even though they've increasingly jacked up the rates on stamps. They can't get it past the point where they can actually break even. Is there anything that you can see that would be wrong with privatizing this enterprise? And is there any risk to Republicans? Is this like a third rail kind of Social Security conversation where you say, hey, you're not going to take away my Social Security and my privilege of licking or at least peeling stamps?
I don't think that there would be a wave of Americans numbering in the millions armed with pitchforks and torches if somebody messed around with the Postal Service. I just don't see that as the kind of issue that's going to cause a civil war to break out. There's, you know, we're all old enough to remember when we first sent an email and just thought how miraculous it was. Now I'm at the point where the idea somebody could take a physical piece of paper and move it across the country in a day and hand deliver this piece of paper to somebody that for 25 cents, that's kind of a miracle to me now, you know. Look, the post office deserves a lot of the grief that they get because as a not only heavily unionized outfit, but as an outfit that up until recently didn't have any competitors, they were not exactly focused on customer service. I remember going to the post office and being vaguely filled with a vague sort of dread that the guy who's going to call on me next, he doesn't like the school I went to, and he doesn't approve of this person I'm dating, and you know he's just got this kind of attitude about things. And yet, back at the other establishment, we did a segment years ago about how I went to the post office in Sherman Oaks and just whistled, and it was just beautifully managed, and it was really well run. And to my lasting memory, when I came back to that post office, I was practically carried on the shoulders, and you know, and led around. Thank you for writing something nice about about us. So I'm of two minds about this. As a bureaucracy, I don't think it's terribly effective or efficient, and clearly it's getting less relevant every day. There is a need for a postal service of some kind. Anybody's experience with FedEx has been, well, FedEx is falling guilty to the same things that the post office was guilty of. You have to wait longer and longer and longer now at FedEx, but nevertheless, you know, when it absolutely positively has to be there overnight, that changed the world. It just changed the world. So I think Steve is on the right general track. I think the post office probably needs to be scaled back quite a bit and deal with essential items. If that means it operates at a loss, I'm not terribly upset about this one, to be honest with you. This to me seems like one of the things that the government is supposed to do, and as you say, it's in the Constitution. So I'm gonna, you know, if I'm gonna die on a hill, it's not going to be we must eliminate the post office to preserve our freedoms. To a large degree, they're largely unsung people that do what is becoming less and less glamorous work all the time, and I'll just be honest with you. I don't know what private company would want the job. I really don't. I cannot imagine going into the business. I can imagine going into the overnight delivery business. You're sending a package for $38, but clawing into the market so that I can deliver a postcard for, 25 cents from Nome, Alaska to Key West is not a market I particularly want to crack. And I think on some level that the post office is one of these kind of subterranean structures like the electrical grid or the water system or that we don't really see and we kind of take for granted. And I personally have I have bigger fights to make than whether or not the post office needs to be privatized or whether they need a little more money. It still serves a function, and I suspect that it probably always will. And I'm with Steve on this. If the only way they make money is on the direct mailings, and by adding a few dollars of tax money to my annual bill would save me from getting those things, then I'd be in favor of it. So I'm going to come down kind of on the meh.
Yeah. I would pay them a flat fee every month for them to throw
to
out
not get
the mass mailers instead of me. Be happy to do
it. Well, in the early days of this republic, that view of the phrase in the Constitution that Congress has the power to establish post offices and post roads, in some cases meant that Congress could simply designate the post roads, for example. So this road that already exists that runs, from Boston to Lexington is a post road, and we're going to recognize that as such. And over the years, that interpretation has broadened to the extent that they said, well, Congress is okay. They can build roads, and they can obviously build these post offices. I think the challenge becomes, and conservatives might want to consider how they word this, because the people who work at the post office are not our enemies. They are people who are trying to earn a living, and they found a job that they can do, and they, in many cases, if they're like people at most workplaces, they wish things were different there, but there's a lot of cruft that's accumulated on top of this organization over the course of 200 some years that makes it difficult to change anything. I can see more of a hybrid solution going forward, and what I would like to see is something that government is ill prepared to do, and that is an analysis of the effectiveness of what it is they're doing and how it might be done better. And so that's just something that's not real popular in government. It's assumed that if you, and I saw this in my role at the local level as a county commissioner, it's assumed that if you say, hey, we'd like to take a look at how the nursing home is run, it's immediately, oh, they want to privatize the nursing home and throw grandma into the streets. And it's the same thing with the mail service. It's like, is the process of postal business the same now as it was in 1953? I think not. Do we have to have as many post office locations as we did back then? Maybe, maybe not. But this is something where you bring in like McKinsey or some consulting firm and you say, let's do an analysis, or one of the, big, how many accounting firms are left? Maybe the big one accounting firm that's left. And bring them in and have them do an analysis and say, okay, here's what we found. Here's the pattern of actual mail distribution. Here's who's using the mailing service. As Steve suggested, it may just be the big operations that are mailing out junk. Who should pay the freight for that? Like, should it, I can understand saying, hey, we want the little old lady who's sending in her rent check to be able to send that for 25 cents. But do we really want JCPenney's to be subsidized in essence because they're having to borrow money to run this operation? Maybe not. Maybe those people should pay for their own business. Maybe they should start a side business that's all they do is deliver that kind of junk. And you can have a box outside your house if you want to receive that kind of junk. In any case, all I'm suggesting is that we look at this with an open mind, whether you're a union member or whether you're somebody who wants to utterly privatize everything. Look at it with an open mind and say, okay, what do people really need? What is the closest to the people level at which we can take care of that need? And what things absolutely must be done at a federal level? And I think you'll find that times have changed, and that calls for different structures and different processes. And I don't think that's crazy. I don't think that's a third rail. I don't think that's some insane suggestion by a bunch of right-wing radicals to basically say, let's make sure we're spending your money as effectively and as efficiently as we can, and maybe even upgrading your service. I'll end on this final note. There's a little place around the corner here. It's about a couple hundred yards from my house. I forget what the name of it is, but it's Mail something. And essentially what it is, it's the front door of the post office and UPS. And you go to this place, and there's people in there are not dressed in uniform, and they've got some tattoos going, and they're kind of rough around the edges sort of characters. But I'll tell you what, I'm in and out of there in less than 5 minutes every single time. And I'm actually just bringing them stuff, which they then hand to the post office. So maybe all the post office really needs is a customer service branch that's privatize that aspect of it and let the background process run as it has been running, or make some efficiency improvements, but put a better face on the post office. And I don't think you do that by running ads showing people smashing corporate mailboxes with sledgehammers. For Bill Whittle and Stephen Green, I'm Scott Ott. Thanks to the members at BillWhittle.com for making Right Angle possible.